Welcome to Sravz Technical Series. In today's session, we are going to discuss the AWS S3 Client service. So in this, we are going to use C++ AWS SDK to perform CRUD operations on AWS S3 bucket. And then once we have this in place, we'll integrate this into the Boost REST API server. So right now we are trying to create services so that we can integrate services into the Boost REST API server. So I'll go to the code page. So this is the data flow diagram. The browser or the REST client will send the JSON, and then the AWS service will do the CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete on the AWS S3 or AWS S3 compatible services like Ceph, MinIO. Then the query response is sent back to the AWS S3 service, and then the service will send the response back to the client. Now, in this demo, we will use Contabo. Contabo is object storage at object S3 compatible object storage. So the same AWS S3 service will work with Contabo too. So we'll go through the code, and before that, we'll do a quick demo like always. So I'll run the service again. I already ran that once, so we'll run it one more time. So if you see here, it's going to use the Boost libraries and then run an executable which I already created. So while it loads, we can just it completed. So this demo will put a sample file, put an object at a particular key, then retrieves the value for that key, then lists the keys in a bucket, and then it deletes the key just added. So this is the demo. The code works. So we'll go back to the code base. So this is the main file which I just showed. So for the Contabo to work, you need to export these two variables, which you can get from the Contabo UI. When you click there and go to their object storage dashboard, you'll get the key value pairs, the key ID and access key. You'll get these two. So you have to export them. And then we also include the AWS.h and AWS S3 Client.h files provided by AWS Client. And then this is a header file we just created for this demo, for this service. So we'll discuss that later. It's up here, so we'll discuss that next. So for AWS S3 SDK to work, we have to first create an options class like this, options object, and then set the log level. In this case, I set it to trace, but you can always change it. And then you have to init the API with the options. So line 13 inits the API, and then line 42 shuts down the API. And then once you init the API, you have to open a context. So these are two braces. So this way you're opening a context. So this whole thing will be in a stack, a single stack. So the idea is you always have to init API, perform the work, and then shut down the API. If you don't do this, then the AWS API doesn't work. So we did that. Then we created S3 client with the region, the bucket name, and the options we just created here. So we stood move that options, S3 client. And then we do a put object with key value, then object put successful, object. So we put object with key, that value, then we put object successful or put object as failed, and then we were doing the get object with that key we just used, and then we printed the value, which should be hello world, and then we list objects with key value pairs, and then we delete object with the same key. So that demo I showed was doing the same. So it was put was successful, then it displayed hello world, then keys in the bucket, then the delete was successful. So that's about the main main file. Then we go to the aws.hpp, AWS S3 HPP, the header file. So we started using the namespaces now. Earlier we weren't using namespaces, but we want to start using namespaces. So we create a namespace Sravz, then services, then AWS, then S3. Then we create a class called client. The client will take the constructor, which will take a region, bucket, and the AWS SDK options. Then it does we have a put object, get object, then list objects, delete object, methods, then and the client destructor. And then we have these private variables for region, bucket, and then the client config, etc. So that's the header file. And then in the the implementation of the header file, AWS S3 CPP, the same, we have the namespaces. We have a bunch of include files, which we need for the class. Then we create the constructor with the string, region, bucket, and options. Then we put those into the, we do initialization and put those in the private variables. And then we create the client config. Now for Contabo to work, you have to override the endpoint, because by default it would take AWS endpoint. But in our case, we want to use Contabo. So you provide the Contabo endpoint, then the scheme, which is always HTTPS. And then you use this client constructor. You pass the client config. Then you have to say this payload signing policy never. The constructor needs that. So I use this, but since it's not for AWS specific, we can skip this. It's more like AWS S3 specific. Then you have to specify false in the constructor. Now, with these three parameters, the S3 client will work for Contabo. So then we do the regular put object with the put request. Then we do the put object, create the request. Then this is all straightforward, bucket key. Then we have to make shade a stream of put object of a string stream, and we have to we'll write the value to that output stream. String stream. Then we set the body to that stream, and we put object request. If outcome is successful, we return true. If outcome return true, else there is an error, return false. So that's the way we do it. Value. So we printed to the output stream. Similarly, for get object, we create the same stream. We create the request object, then send the request to the get object. If the outcome is successful, from the body we'll write it to a string stream, and then put that from the buffer we write it to the string stream, and then return the C string from the string stream. So that's how we get the results from the get object. Then S3 client list object will list the objects, and delete objects will delete the object. And then S3 client destructor, the idea was to set up the shutdown API in this, but it did not work. Per AWS documentation, everything should be in a single stack. So here, if you see, we created a single stack in which we created operations. or you could call this a closure, in which we created these operations. But if you split this init and shutdown into the constructor and the destructor functions, they don't happen at the same stack level. These two will be called at a separate time in their own stacks. So shutdown did not work there in the client, in the destructor. So for that reason, I put the shutdown outside the client. And before using the client, the calling function should ensure that the init and the calling function should ensure to init API and shutdown API. So with that, we conclude the AWS S3 C++ client implementation. In the next session, we will integrate these two services we have developed into the Beast REST API server. Thank you for watching.